My name is Josh Diekman. I'm the Director of the Planning and Public Works Department. I think Mr. Kruger gave a very good introduction, although he may have set the bar pretty high for expectations about how riveting this is going to be. We are pretty pleased with the information that we have to share with you today and appreciate that you made some time for this. I'm joined in the audience by Nancy Campbell, the department's Business and Financial Operations Manager and the project manager for this effort, and as mentioned, also some members from Burke Consulting who performed much of the work that we're going to be talking about today. Also in the audience and online are the department's deputy directors and some of the division managers and financial managers from their respective teams, all of whom contributed to this effort and can be available if there are any follow-up questions from the council. Today we've got about 24 slides and we expect that it's going to take us about half an hour to go through those, and we're going to stop at the end of each section to answer any questions that you might have. Next slide, please. Last fall, during the mid-biennium supplemental budget review, as mentioned, Council allocated $100,000 to this study, and that language is shown up on the screen. Mr. Kruger covered some of this already, but as a reminder, this measure was prompted in part by the unplanned budget shortfall in the Building and Development Fund, Fund 176. Mr. Kruger mentioned that we are going to be coming forward separately with some fund policy. We're going to touch on some of the underlying research that we did that's going to inform that, but Council's going to be considering that at a separate time. As Council's aware, Planning and Public Works represents the county's largest department and has the most complex budget. The department oversees 23 funds and 28 sub-funds and is responsible for delivering $1.2 billion in the biennial budget. While Council knew that the timeline and the available funding of this effort could not provide a comprehensive overview of all of those funds and sub-funds, there was an expectation, as covered by the language on the screen and by Mr. Kruger's summary, that this work would provide some insights about how the department's practices could be improved. Next slide, please. This slide shows a high-level overview of what was included in the consultant's scope. As I noted on the previous slide, while the study didn't do an in-depth review of every fund, it did look at the principles and best management practices of how those funds are managed. As Burke will describe in the coming slides, they reviewed processes and procedures and compared those to best management practices in other agencies to identify opportunities for improvement. I think it's important to note that the department identified some of those areas last fall, and we didn't wait to begin our work to ensure that we're implementing best practices for this consultant work to be done. I'll be coming back at the end of the presentation to talk about some of the work that we already have underway, as well as what we're going to be doing with the results and the findings from this study. I'll also be covering in the coming slides, the consultant will be covering an overview of their work. As noted on the screen, that didn't get into individual decisions of each fund, such as the setting of rates and fees for different services. Those are usually very in-depth and detailed analyses that involve projections. Very frequently, we hire consultants to assist with that work. And when we bring conversations about rate setting and fee setting to the council as part of the biennial budget development process or the supplemental process, we'll usually be referencing much more in-depth work on those rates and fees than we'll be talking about today. For the next several slides, Catherine Getz, the consultant project lead, is going to provide an overview of their work, including the process, findings, and recommendations, after which I'll come back to talk about what we're doing with the results of the report and what will come next. But before I hand it off to Catherine, as noted, I want to pause at the end of this section to see if you have any questions.
Any questions from the members? I don't see any.
Good afternoon. My name is Catherine Getz from Burke Consulting. I'm one of the leads of our finance and economics team, and it's been a great pleasure to work with your PPW team on this project. So as the director said, I'll share some information about our approach and our findings and recommendations. So a little bit about our approach. We identified best practices, such as those published by Government Finance Officers Association, and we developed criteria to assess each fund. We reviewed department policy documentation, historical financial data, and 6-year forecasts for each fund. We interviewed the fund managers and analysts who are closest to the work to understand how documentation aligns with department practices. We interviewed some staff in other counties to learn about ways that other jurisdictions are handling similar challenges with fund management. We specifically talked to staff who manage planning and permit functions. And then we assessed fund policies and practices against best practices and prepared recommendations both for the department as a whole and for each fund. Next slide. So these are the categories that we worked in. Policy documentation and fund management is one. Policy documentation should be clear and transparent. The department should have policies related to things like revenue management, cost recovery, and minimum fund balance. Fee setting practices should have a documented methodology, established cost recovery targets, and a schedule for updates. And third, fund balance targets. And these should reflect operational needs, the sensitivity to market factors that could impact the sufficiency of reserves, and best practices. Next slide. As Director Diekman mentioned, these are the funds we studied which were identified as a priority. These aren't all of PPW's funds, but we believe our recommendations can apply to other funds as well. So we grouped funds into these categories, which are a little bit different than their actual classification, but we did this because of their similar characteristics and so that recommendations could ideally apply across funds. So operating funds pay for ongoing programs and services. The primary expenditures are personnel, services, utilities, and interfund transfers to other funds. Revenues are generally ongoing and predictable. Capital funds pay for projects, and revenues typically come from other funds. Special revenue funds, as we've described them here, are those that collect revenues and then are transferred to another fund for expenditure. Enterprise funds are considered like a business as costs are recovered through fees charged to users. And another category is operating funds with capital expenditures. So these don't neatly fall into one of the other categories. For example, the airport fund and the ferry fund have operating and capital expenditures, but they're not technically enterprise funds because they receive transfers from other funds. And another is the equipment rental fund, which is an internal service fund. Next slide. Okay, so the first step in our approach was to review policy documentation and fund management practices. So we wanted to determine if there are documented department-wide and fund-specific policies. Examples for things we looked for include the services the fund provides, who the customers are, whether the service should be supported by the taxpayer in general, and if not, how to establish cost recovery for that service. Expectations about accounting practices, budgeting practices, monitoring and reporting, documentation for eligible uses of the fund or department level indirect costs, and appropriate uses of fund balance and strategies and expected timeframes for replenishing the fund balance if it's used. Next slide, please. When we talk about fees, we generally include fees, charges, rates, anything that is where a payment is made for service. But in this category, good documentation for fees states the methodology, the interval, and the process for updating fees and cost recovery principles. So we reviewed documented policies and looked for if the purpose of the fee is described, how they're calculated, if they're calculated to recover the full cost of providing service, and how frequently they are updated. As Director Diekman mentioned, we didn't review calculations for setting rates and fees, but we've included in recommendations where a review of the methodology or a formal rate study would be beneficial. Next slide, please. Our report focuses primarily on fund balance, which is defined as the difference between revenues and expenditures at a point in time. This is a little different than a reserve. A reserve is designed to have a specific event or situation that would allow its use. An example is an emergency reserve that would be needed if there was an unexpected capital replacement or an unexpected decline in revenues, for example. So we reviewed policy documentation regarding the use of fund balance and targets and reviewed actual and projected fund balance for each fund compared to those stated targets. So we looked for documented target, how actuals compared to the target, and how the fund balance target aligns with the operating or capital needs of the fund and the predictability of fund revenues. So I'll transition to our findings, but if there's any questions at this point, I'm happy to answer.
Any questions? Nope.
Okay, great. Okay. Next slide, please. Okay, thank you. Regarding policy documentation and fund management, most funds have a policy document. PPW calls them a fund fact sheet. Some would benefit from additional detail, especially when questions arise or when there's transition among staff. For example, relevant references to the county code or descriptions of the relationship to other funds and expected transfers. The department prepares 6-year plans for all funds, and these are useful as a planning tool. Next slide, please. On fee setting practices, formal fee studies that tie to operations and capital costs generally result in more sustainable fund management. Regular adjustment of fees based on inflation or a rate study or a regular review of the methodology improves transparency and customer service by avoiding a large increase in 1 year, for example. Rate studies that are conducted by a third party can be beneficial when staff would benefit from additional specialized expertise. Some funds do not have documented cost recovery targets, and some that do may not achieve them in all years, and there are different practices for managing this across funds. Next slide, please. Regarding fund balance targets, some funds do not have a documented fund balance policy. In some cases, the policy target used in practice does not match the documented target. So keeping this documentation up to date really creates clarity and continuity in fund management and helps identify when fees or charges need to be updated to reflect changes in expenses. And for some funds, the fund balance is projected to fall below the policy target in several years of the 6-year plan. So identifying this potential risk helps inform decisions about future expenditures and fee adjustments. Next slide, please. Okay, this very colorful and full chart is probably easier to read in the report, but it's included here. And on the next slide, it's like a smaller version I can talk through a little bit. But this is a visual representation of our kind of assessing each fund against criteria. And this is a way for us to see at a high level where to explore further. Like the indications on this chart may be an area of concern, but it helps us determine where to look a little bit further. Next slide, please. So this is a kind of a smaller subset of the larger chart we just showed, just shows a few funds. And I can talk through a little bit of how this reflects our analysis. For example, the county road fund, the blighted property maintenance fund, and the airport fund show that expenditures will exceed revenues in each year of the 6-year plan. So that begs us to look a little bit further. But as an example, the county road fund does not include unsecured grants. And staff is aware of this. So this revenue would balance with planned expenditures. So that's just an area to watch. We see that the building development fund, the airport fund, and the ferry fund would benefit from a documented methodology for calculating fees and a process for updating and reviewing them. And then we can see that the building development fund balance was lower than the target in 3 of the past 6 years. So that would be an area to focus on as well. I'll move into recommendations unless there's any questions.
Any questions on this one? Nope.
Okay.
Nope.
Okay, thank you. So these are high level, these are recommendations that we would say apply to all funds. And first on policy documentation, 1, document the purpose of each fund, document the appropriate use of fund balance, describe the key revenues and expenditures in the fund, and provide periodic budget monitoring reports to leadership. Regular monitoring can help identify issues early on. So these are based on policy documentation, expectations, and standards, and more detailed recommendations at the fund level are based on gaps that we found in our review. Next slide, please. Regarding fee setting practices, write and maintain department-wide and fund-specific fee setting policies. These should include cost recovery targets, even if the target is not full cost recovery. Documentation should include expectations of transfers to other funds, as those are known obligations. And plan for regular fee increases to ensure that they're predictable and they support good customer service. Next slide. So we have two slides that will cover, touch on fund balance targets. So I'll speak to these first ones. The first category is special revenue funds that transfer to other funds. So these collect revenues and then the revenues are transferred to another fund for actual spending. So these may not require a minimum fund balance because it'd be important to consider the relationship between those funds and consider each fund's policy to avoid redundancy. Enterprise funds, we recommend a 3-month minimum fund balance target based on budgeted operating expenditures. If the fund has debt service obligations, the fund balance should include an amount equal to the following year's payment, as that is a known obligation. And operating funds with capital expenditures, these are the airport and the ferry and the internal service fund that manages the fleet. 3-month, it is recommended to have a 3-month fund balance target based on budgeted operating expenditures. A larger fund balance, such as 4 months, may be appropriate if the fund has often unplanned maintenance expenses like the airport or the ferry. And consider establishing a capital reserve to fund unplanned capital needs. This could apply to the equipment rental fund, which manages the fleet. And this could be based on like a share of the value of the assets. Next slide. For operating funds, we recommend establishing a 3-month fund balance target based on budgeted operating expenditures. This would be ideal and it aligns with best practice for a fund with rather stable revenues and flexible expenditures. So this would be sufficient when revenues are lower than budgeted or expenditures exceed the budget, give you some flexibility to adjust. If the fund has more volatile revenues and fixed expenditures, so there's a little bit less flexibility, you could consider establishing the same fund balance target, but also an operating reserve to address larger fluctuations in revenues. And if there's a fund with prepaid liabilities like permit, like the building development fund, you could establish a reserve for those obligations as well. And last, capital funds, these receive revenues from other funds. So like the special revenue funds, it would be important to consider the relationship between funds to avoid redundancy. So fund balance targets for these funds may not be recommended. Next slide. In our report, I won't go through them, but in the report, there are recommendations for each fund that touch on these 3 categories. They're on pages 15 to 19 of the report, and we have an appendix at the end which contains more detailed information about each fund if you'd like to reference that. And then I'm happy to take questions. Next, I'll just turn it back to you, Director Diekman.
Any questions? Oh, we got a question. Councilmember Morrell.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question pertaining to the organizations that you looked at best practice with, Kitsap County, whatever. Within those funds, was any of them recouping 100% of their cost within those budgets?
I think the one that had probably the closest to what you're describing was Kitsap County for their planning and permit function. They had a pretty well established and documented policy on how they would set fees, and they had and what the fund balance would be. And say if they were under collecting in regards to the fund balance, they might adjust the fees upward. If they were over collecting, they might adjust the fees down to ensure that it was meeting the fund balance target. I think that was probably the closest example.
Okay. And did they, to maintain that 100%, did they move personnel around, or did they just keep the same staff when the permits went down?
Oh, I see your question. I don't believe so. They had quite a large fund balance, maybe 12 months. I think was intended to address that so that they wouldn't necessarily have to, or it would give them time to adjust in response to the market.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
All right. Any other questions? Councilmember.
Thank you, Chair. This may be a question for the department, but in regards to cost recovery, during the comprehensive plan, we established a policy of 100% cost recovery. Was that just for certain funds, or I got the impression that was for all of our development and building funds? Or I'm trying to remember. Because it sounded like we don't have 100% cost recovery policies for all of our funds. I thought that was our goal.
Thank you, Councilmember Denson. Josh Diekman again. You may recall that, well, at the beginning of the conversation we referenced, and Mr. Kruger referenced, that we're going to be coming back before council with new fund policy for Fund 176. You may recall that we previously had cost recovery policy for that fund that we had to suspend during the last supplemental budget because we had to take some actions to make that fund whole. The fund cost recovery policies are adopted on a fund-by-fund basis. One of the things I'll be talking about as I close out the presentation is the need for the department to go fund by fund to make sure that we have documentation for each of those so that when we make proposals to council about what's included in the budget, we can substantiate the thought process that's behind each one of the budget proposals that we bring you.
Yeah, that would be helpful. It would be helpful for me to understand which funds we consider cost recovery not to be achievable or desirable, which was the language that the consultant used, and the justification for that would be helpful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. Any other questions? All right. Oh, yep, we got Councilmember Morrell.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You know, pertaining, it would be interesting to take a look at your 100% cost recovery challenge. Very few branches of government have 100% cost recovery. We talked about parks departments. Their recovery rate is maybe 30%. So I'm kind of curious to see, is there an RCW that says you need to be 100% cost recovery pertaining to, and I'm talking permitting and planning?
Councilmember Bell.
Lauren Flemister, Deputy Director, Planning Community Development Branch. Let me attempt to answer that. I cannot answer the RCW question, but what I can tell you sort of about building and development is that is something that we believe to be achievable for 100% cost recovery. I think kind of parsing this in terms of practicalities versus, policy decisions versus, unfortunate circumstances. We're able to sort of frame that as a program that is run like a business. And we have other funds that are run like businesses where we do have 100% cost recovery. Building and development is one that we believe we can run like a business when we have our fees regularly updated and that we're keeping pace with costs in the market. We are able to come very, very close to that cost recovery. In fact, we'll be talking obviously more about it in the coming months, but we're seeing that now. As we've adjusted fees, we're able to keep at that pace. So I think for us, it's really about understanding, again, policy trade-offs, and then the services we provide where we're not able to charge our constituents or customers the cost to actually run whatever that operation is. But in the case, again, of 176 building and development, we run that like a business. That should be 100% cost recovery.
Which, yeah, it is. And you've heard me say this, before when we were going through this. It's tough to run an agency when you have a monopoly and you're trying to get 100% cost recovery, and there's no incentive to control your cost. And so I don't know how you could put a business model on a monopoly. So, because there's no incentives. So that's what
There are some incentives, like when the market slows down, being able to maintain our staffing levels and not having to lay people off, for example.
well,
That is an incentive
that's
for
on
us.
your fund balance. You know, I will read you an article that I just got, and I would like to have your response on it to see how you're adjusting your, 100% cost recovery, because someone just pulled the toilet bowl plunger in the industry and permitting is down substantially. And what are you going to do to make it more affordable and more predictable for our development community to build in Pierce County? Not just continue to hit them with fees with no, we're going to do this for you. We're going to be more predictable and we're going to be deliverable on what we're going to do. There has been no discussion about, okay, maybe use letting the industry, and we had a roundtable session on this, to let the industry do a lot of the things that permitting and planning did. So that way we didn't have cost involved in it, that they had the engineers, the architects, the designers that could do a lot of this industrial type change orders that would happen, or redlining that would happen. So I am definitely going to be interested to see how you're adjusting during this downward trend right now, that there is no end in sight. So,
And we look forward to the continued conversation, and we also look forward to having dialogue during the legislative session. Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments? Okay.
Thank you, Councilmember, for the questions. And before I dive back into the rest of my presentation, I just wanted to express our thanks for the ability to talk about those cost recovery targets and to introduce those conversations, because they are important conversations, even when we do have, even when we are the only service provider. So there are other opportunities like that, including our sewer utility, for instance, where we have an interest in providing this transparency, because in some cases we are the only game in town, and we want to be good stewards of the funds and resources that are entrusted to us. So we appreciate the opportunity to be here. Next steps. So Catherine indicated that Council has the opportunity to find more details in the report. I will confirm that the report is available in your packet, and so that is publicly available online. Over the next few slides, I want to highlight a couple of key findings, and I'm going to close about what the department is already doing and what we're going to be doing next. So as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, we've already been working on some complementary efforts, and underpinning of those efforts is the department's strategic plan, which was adopted earlier this year and prioritizes fiscal sustainability and stewardship. So that's part of what we're talking about today. Every fund manager in the department is reviewing the policies and procedures for the oversight of each fund. And those are being centrally coordinated by the department's business and financial operations group under Nancy Campbell's leadership. As I mentioned, Nancy was the lead for this effort as well. And we're helping use the findings of this study to inform the actions that we're taking for all of our funds, not just the ones that were included in the study. Part of our effort is going to be, and is currently, to standardize documentation for the policies and procedures used for each fund. We already talked about the cost recovery. That's one of those elements. But it ensures, having that documentation ensures that everyone's working from uniform assumptions, and it assists for continuity, as Catherine mentioned, when there are changes in roles or responsibilities. Importantly, as I mentioned before, it also makes it easy to reference any enabling legislation authorities or allowable uses, as I mentioned, cost recovery targets, and to come before Council during the budget development process with well understood principles. Next slide, please. In addition to the documentation and foundational principles regarding the management of each fund, it's important that we also have good data to understand the status of each fund. Historically, it's been very difficult to see real-time information, and the department has had to invest significant time and energy into querying data and creating reports to get a snapshot of the status of each fund. In practice, this meant that we were able to do that with less frequency than we would have otherwise liked, and that created more risk and provided more lag time before course corrections could be made. The department began looking on how to improve this last fall, and the finance department quickly jumped in and developed a budget dashboard that all departments can use, not just planning and public works. A snapshot of that dashboard is shown on the screen, and this powerful tool provides daily updates that all our fund managers can use for each one of the funds. The ease of accessing information has in turn allowed us to improve communication and oversight of the funds. Fund managers are now meeting regularly with finance and department leadership to review the status of each fund, and we're also providing regular status updates to the executive's office, particularly for the funds that were identified during the last budget development process, such as the development services funds and the airport fund. Next slide, please. In addition, the department's working on policies for rates and fees to ensure that each fund with rates and fees is considering all of the elements that were recommended through this study. These policies will inform the conversations that we have with the executive and council during the adoption of any rate or fee updates during the budget process. And I would like to express appreciation for the funding that the council provided last fall, because it really enabled us to explore this exercise with Burke. Council's made an investment in the department, and moving forward, the department's going to continue working with the finance department to see if we can identify any opportunities for this work to benefit the rest of the county. Next slide, please. So in closing, the documentation, performance management, and dashboarding measures you heard about today are going to improve not only the confidence in managing our funds and the transparency of our budgeting decisions, but it will allow us to make data-based recommendations, demonstrate strong fiscal responsibility, and build trust with the public. I'd be happy to answer any additional questions you have at this time.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation. Is there any questions from council members? Councilmember Morrell.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You had talked about suspending the financial policy, fiscal policy. When are you going to be coming back with a new financial policy that this council can take a look at? Because I don't know if we suspended, we didn't suspend it indefinitely. So
That's correct,
what are we
please go ahead,
looking
Lauren.
at?
It was submitted into EDS yesterday, so it's running through the system. I believe we'll be to you in July to discuss.
Great,
Thanks.
thank you.
All right. Okay, any other questions? Wow. I don't see any other questions.
I
No
would
comments.
like to read something and to see what your response is. And this is from the Puget Sound Regional Council, okay? It said, in 2025, the Puget Sound region's permitted its lowest total housing units in a decade. As regional leaders grapple with a slowing economy, unusual job loss, and certain uncertainty about the future of housing affordability, the Bellevue, Everett, Seattle, Tacoma metro area permitted 14,000 housing units last year. 10 years ago, we did 32,000 units. This is a 10-year low. So I am just kind of curious. I own a commercial construction company. My equipment has not moved for 5 months. I have, since the dot-com bubble, I have never seen this before. I checked with all my developers, Sierra, Poe, Fouché, those are the ones who build the big box. None of them have a project. The only project that's going on is Auburn right now, and Sierra's doing that. So the industrial, commercial end of things have fallen off a cliff. And we have had a great build out in Pierce County. And we have a very high vacancy rate right now for spec warehouses. So one of the challenges was we were going to build it and they will come. Unfortunately, due to economic challenges that this state has, they haven't come. So they have a lot of vacant buildings. So there is not going to be any large projects going on in Pierce County that I know of. Now, maybe you guys got a better crystal ball than the developers that I talk to. But if housing is down, and I don't know if Pierce County has seen a downward spiral, but there again, when we talk about cost factors and impact fees and other things that we seem to love to lump on to the process, I don't know where that's going to get us. You know, they talk about the amount of jobs that have been lost in the region, mainly in the King County area, mainly in downtown. But that has repercussions throughout the area. And so I'm a little concerned about what the crystal ball looks like moving forward. And I feel for you guys, because you're trying to ramp up and all of a sudden the rug gets pulled out. How are you going to deal with that? And what is the status of the permitting in Pierce County?
Thank you, Councilmember Merrill. I'll start with some initial reactions, and then I see David Kinley to my left, who can provide a little bit of a sneak peek into some of the conversations that we'll be having regarding permitting in Fund 176 and our ability to have confidence in our forecasting there. As you noted, there are some trends nationwide, in fact, that show some slowdown in the housing market or housing construction that to varying degrees is experienced in every community. And that is certainly something that we are looking at how we can move the needle, not just in terms of the services that we provide for reviewing of developments, but also in incenting development where we can and the affordability of that development. Regarding commercial housing, it, like others, is very cyclical. And it impacts the economy, which in turn impacts our ability to provide services. Sometimes that also comes with a silver lining in that we're seeing, for instance, and when we go out to put our major capital construction projects to bid, that means the county is actually receiving good bid prices for those projects at this time. So there's
runways?
Pardon?
AK runways?
And for instance, the runway project, yes, that's a great example of that. And the sword does definitely cut both ways. But we need to make sure that we're factoring that into our projections and that all funds are having confidence in our look ahead to the future. So with that in mind, I know we're going to be coming back to you to talk more specifically about Fund 176, but with taking advantage of David's presence here today, I'll let him talk a little bit more about that fund particularly.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I just wanted to address some of the questions, comments and questions there. Can't really get into the policies and economics of things at this point. What I can say, we a week and a half ago had our multi-county meeting. We meet with other permitting departments from 5 other counties twice a year. And so we're always collaborating, comparing notes, where are things at. Every other county was talking about how they're seeing decreases in permitting, 25, 40% in that range, and a lot of their funds are impacted. We are not seeing that decrease in permitting. In fact, our permitting is up over the last 2 years. So we think that's a good news story. Pierce County is a great place to build, will continue to be a great place to build. We obviously, interest rates continue to be the topic that we hear builders talking about, especially on the multifamily side of things. Those projects are really hard to fund. And so there's an impact there. However, we still see those projects coming through, and we've had quite a few come through in just the last few months. So ongoing, we feel confident that we will continue to be able to fund our division and continue to do the permitting work that's necessary while we're continuing to work through some of these, the fiscal checks and balances, the just being wise with our funds and being able to project out for staffing. So I think we're sitting a lot better than a lot of other counties at this point in time.
Great. I appreciate that update. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, any other questions from members? Well, thank you for that fiscal review. A lot of stuff in there. Thank your staff for getting it together. So.